This week, we're joined by Christine Riley Miller with Dunkin' Brands. And we're talking this week about the notion of organization and the challenges of getting folks to buy in. And Dunkin' is quite an organization. 20,000 points of distribution, 70 countries, $11 billion in system sales, which translates into around about a billion of company revenue. So it's big in that respect, but there's a couple of particular complications that are worth noting, I think. One is largely a franchise model, and the implications of that for corporate responsibility are you don't own those stores. They're separate businesses, so decisions around hiring, waste use, energy use, all those things are made by the business owner, not Dunkin' Brands, not you.
Correct.
And then the other dynamic is you are competing in the quick-serve food industry, and the demands there around guest experience about speed, efficiency, satisfaction, and don't try to put anything else into that equation. Thank you very much, right? And so pretty good challenge. You've been there 8+ years, and you were the first person to have this role. So it seems like a pretty good place to start. Going back to the beginning, day one, what was it like?
I think initially it was very exciting, to be the first person in this role and think about that opportunity. And I came in with a charge to help draft the first corporate social responsibility report, which was a terrific opportunity and an excuse to talk to people in the organization. So I had to, it was a mandate, and I could go in and have those conversations. And it also helped me understand, where are we today? What do people know about sustainability? What's their perspective on sustainability? How do they receive and react to the conversations that I'm having with them? So who might be my allies and who might be my not allies? Who are the folks that are friendly and who are skeptics? So that helped inform and also gave me a good baseline for where we were. So I think initially it was very, very exciting to be able to go into that, and then over the course of 8 years, sort of evolved.
The beginning days, how would you describe the organization? What adjectives, phrases?
I would describe them similarly to how I describe them now. It's a very fun, we're the parent company of Dunkin' Donuts and Baskin-Robbins, both very fun brands. It's hard not to be when it's coffee, donuts, and ice cream. So lots of folks who are passionate about who we are and what we do. We have folks who have been there for, 20, 30, 40 years. They believe in the brand. We have a lot of fun. So I think it's still, there's that element of fun that's infused into everything that we do. But I think the passion for the brand also is both a plus. It's kind of a double-edged sword, because don't touch the brand. We feel good about the brand, particularly when you talk about the foam cup. This is iconic to the brand. From a sustainability perspective, what are you looking to do? Are you trying to change the brand? How does that impact who we are and our identity and what our guests expect of us? So I think that's part of what may have changed over time, but there's still that passion and fun and love of the brand.
Fair amount of education, understanding, relationship building in the early stages, exactly what it means, what your agenda is.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, so we had to, so I think when you're new, you're the first person in that role, you don't have a huge team. I had one person on my team at the time, and still have one person on my team that does the sustainability work. So we can't do my knowledge is a mile wide and an inch deep, and my ability to actually implement is reliant upon the engagement of internal subject matter experts. So I don't have relationships with suppliers. I don't do product development. I don't do the marketing. I don't build and design new restaurants and look at the energy efficiency of those restaurants. So I really had to get folks on board who did that work, believed in that work, and felt like it was important and valuable to integrate sustainability into the work that they do every day. And they weren't mandated to do it. It wasn't part of their job. And so this was very much a labor of love in many cases. So identifying who those folks were who understood the ROI was one of the first opportunities and challenges.
One more question. I want to go back to organization for a second. I think you said you have still one person on your team. So 8 years in,
Yep.
you were still a team of two, all those numbers we just mentioned. So one of the things we talked about in the course also was different kinds of ways to organize. Maybe not
Yeah.
the traditional way. It sure doesn't sound like you have a traditional organizational structure.
Right. So in terms of, I would love more resources. Headcount is really hard in a franchise organization. You've got to keep those overhead costs very, very lean. So we do rely very heavily internally on the internal subject matter experts. And I think you have more success when you have advocates and evangelists scattered throughout the company. So an example of that is we have a guy in our design and construction team who really believes in sustainability, very much thinks that this is right for the organization, has a personal investment in it. And so he, of his own volition, created our Dunkin' Donuts Green Achievement, our DD Green Achievement Sustainable Restaurant Program. He brought that to our team and said, hey, I designed this program for us based on what he knew would drive sustainability throughout restaurants that would adopt this program. Can you help me sell it in? And so when we never would have been able to do that. We don't have that content expertise, but you have someone who looks at an organization that's moving more towards a sustainable mindset, and he thinks to himself, I can do this. I think I can sell this in, and let me go partner and figure out how we do that. So that was something he did on his own, but is probably one of my, I think is one of the greatest accomplishments is that someone felt like they had that permission and they did it. And we have 150 DD Green Achievement restaurants now. And our newest building spec and design integrates all of those components. So I think that we will eventually sunset a formal program because that overall building spec is now meeting that expectation. So franchisees can build to that model without actually having to participate in that program specifically. So they're doing it without really even knowing they're doing it.
Yeah, that's great. It's really your structure and design as a franchise model actually led you to where a lot of people are trying to move to now, trying to integrate it in different areas. You started that way, which is terrific.
Right. It was sometimes when you the only way you can be successful is if you can get a lot of folks who who believe in what you're doing and want to think about how can they make this real in their own lives. And so I think that's part of the beauty of being the entrepreneur in the organization is you figure out who are your internal stakeholders, the ones that are going to help you build your sustainability program and your sustainability organization, and that organization isn't necessarily having someone who's a direct report.
Right.
So I think that's one of the most valuable lessons I've learned.
That idea of finding the champions out there, and they need to be out there, better out there,
Yes.
rather than have a staff of hundreds who are either with a big budget or very compelling, can make great cases. You're going to be much better off with folks embedded in the organizations.
Right. And there's a lot of talk in sustainability that leadership is the most important stakeholder, and leadership is important. It's really helpful when you have a mandate from leadership, but you're not as successful if folks are doing it because they're being told by their boss to do it or they're being told by their CEO to do it. I find sometimes that top-down, bottom-up approach works really well because the CEO and even the VPs aren't the ones that are calling the suppliers and saying, hey, are you complying with our policy, or we're introducing a new policy. How are you compliant with that? How can you comply? How do we work with you in having quarterly calls, et cetera? That's not the VP and the CEO. It's the folks that are in the trenches every day doing the work.
Well, you also made a really good point, and I think that sometimes when there are courses like this and people learn about corporate social responsibility and sort of what to do, the most important thing is know your business, know your industry sector, and be relevant. Because not everything is going to work for you the way it works for somebody else. So I love that notion of that you were very real and relevant to your model.
Right.
And that's what actually made you really successful.
Yeah, we, as a franchise model, we're 100% franchised globally. So we can influence, but we can't mandate. And so we often have to make trade-offs in terms of we can give the tools to the franchisees, we can educate them on that, and then hope that they're going to embrace it. But then there's other places where, such as supply chain, where in the U.S. we have a direct relationship with those suppliers for the most part. We can implement programming directly. internationally, our franchisees own the relationships with the suppliers. So we have to work with our franchisees internationally to implement some of that programming, and by and large, they are on board with that. You have to think about who your audience is. There's another tactic that I've used in selling in some of our sustainability efforts. So, for example, the work on the cup, I often was not the voice of that conversation. I would rely on our head of supply chain, because if the CSR person is talking about the cup, then instantly it's about the fact that it's bad for the environment. When your head of supply chain is talking about moving away from the foam cup, the perception is very different. Is it good for our supply chain? If he's advocating for it, there must be some business interest in doing that. So sometimes it's just knowing when you're not the right voice, and when you, as the advocate for that, could cloud the decision making or skew the perception of the person who's hearing that message. And so understanding who your audience is and having the right messenger can helped me be much more successful early on in terms of selling in some of those conversations, or even opening the conversation.
That's great.
I think it's a great example because it's different than some of the ones we talked about before, where they lead with their values, that they're very much embedded, some from day one we talked about. And to your point, that's not the case with Dunkin'. It's different.
Right.
It doesn't show up that way. But it is now part of the company in a way it wasn't before.
Right.
And Dunkin' is talking about it in a way that's valid and truthful for Dunkin'. And Dunkin', more importantly, Dunkin', I think, is acting on it in a way that's valid and truthful. You're dealing with issues in palm oil, you're dealing with issues in employee engagement, you're dealing with issues in terms of hiring, diversity. All these things are happening. But the rhetoric isn't quite, up here along the way some of the competitors you do it too.
And you have different consumer perceptions of sustainability. So in Europe, we are talking a lot about our coffee sourcing, how we source it, why that, what's happening at origin. We have certified product. That's really important to that market. In other places, less important. It's a harder case to make with different, marketing departments in different areas to say you should be talking about our coffee sourcing and our tree to cup process and, our partnerships, our certifications. In some cases, they say our consumers don't care. We're not gonna. That's not the message we're gonna lead with because it won't resonate. In Europe, 100% resonates. We need to be doing more. So there's also that balancing act sometimes internally in terms of do you lead with values in some places, and do you use that to demonstrate that it's adding value, that it's resonating, that it's driving sales, and maybe we should try it here where you think it might not resonate, but it could. And let's see what happens.
Expectations definitely have changed, and they're high, very demanding.
Yes.
And so you touched on one subject I want to come back to. You mentioned the cup.
Yes, you can't talk about sustainability at Dunkin' without talking about foam.
Sometimes those expectations are not always realistic, and in fairness, sometimes they're not always fully informed. And so, on one hand, you look at the cup and say, well, that's environmentally harmful, and we should change that. It's very visible. It's an icon for the brand, and of course, we want to do that. And yet, I'm going to guess in between those two, it looks easy, but maybe not so much. There's a lot of tension, and you've sort of trod that path a few times. So tell us a little bit about the challenge of the cup at Dunkin', please.
Sure. I think, so our chief communications officer likes to tell this funny story that when she came in to Dunkin', which was about 6 months before I started, she said, "Why don't we just change the cup? It's so easy. We'll just change it." But 8 years ago, so I will illustrate the wonderful qualities of foam. One is it's 94% air, so it's very inexpensive. It's a very inexpensive product, but the 94% air means it's also highly insulating. So it keeps your coffee hot for a very long time. It keeps it's very cool to touch. And the lid is unique in that it is resealable. So if I won't do it here for the sake of illustration, but I could, in theory, turn it upside down and it wouldn't fall over. So if it tips out of your cup holder, or if you're on a subway, public transportation, it's not gonna splash all over you. So this is the cup that we've had since we were founded in the 60s. Our guests love it for all of the attributes that I just described. And when I started 8 years ago, it was this cup or the cup that we use for our special product, which is a single wall paper cup. It requires a sleeve. to hold for heat retention, or not retention, but for heat transfer. It has an open dome lid. We have a lot of drive-throughs. That's very dangerous. You don't want to send hot black coffee through a drive-through that then spills all over. There's consumer safety issues associated with that. So our options at the time were these two cups. When you talk about anyone who is an avid Dunkin' consumer or an avid coffee drinker, don't mess with my morning routine. I know what I like, I know what I get, I love it. Don't mess with that. So we were very, very careful in terms of thinking about, one, what is the environmental impact? It's that standard question that every sustainability practitioner asks. What's the environmental impact, environmental or social impact? What's the business impact? And then what's the impact on our stakeholders in terms of what their experience is? So we knew we couldn't just replace it with this. This is a differentiator for us that our guests love. So over the years, we've had a cross-functional cup team that has been working on the cup diligently for many years. We've looked at a whole host of cups ranging from cups made from mushrooms, cups that had something in them that would break them down, but the idea of something that in your product that maybe ate the product didn't seem all that appealing. So we've explored a whole host of options. There's some new products that have come out in the past few years, and there's also a number of bans on the product that have been passed in municipalities in the past few years. So we have two products that we currently use. This is a polypropylene, expanded polypropylene. It has the same properties as foam in terms of heat retention and thermal transfer, though you may notice the cup lid is not the same, and it isn't resealable. The other thing that's interesting to note in terms of the ergonomics of lids, this one you may not be aware, but you sip, you sort of suck the coffee out. It's like a sippy cup. This one pours. So if you are used to this and then you do this, you suddenly have a lot of hot coffee in the back of your throat. So we have a lot of guest dissatisfaction with this cup and lid combination in particular. But we use this in markets that have banned expanded polystyrene. We also have this cup, which is a double wall paper cup. There's an outer sleeve that's built into it, so you don't need a separate sleeve like this. And it has the same heat retention and thermal transfer qualities, but it has a PLA lid, open dome lid like that. So we use that in markets that have banned both expanded polystyrene and rigid polystyrene, which is the high impact polystyrene, which is the lid. Neither one of these, though, is particularly compelling. This one is widely recyclable. They're both more expensive. It's just the reality of nothing is as inexpensive as foam. And our guests don't love it. So, and paper, people think is widely recyclable, but it's not widely recyclable. This is recyclable in about 60% of communities. This is in about 30. So we had to factor in what is the environmental impact, what's the impact to our guest, and what's the cost impact to our franchisees. And you don't want to lose guests because they hate your cup. And they make choices to go elsewhere. So we are in the process still of exploring additional cups. We have one that we're looking at that we're hoping to roll out as a test in the next few months. It is a double wall paper cup with this lid.
Oh,
so what we're hoping is that the guest, appreciates the functionality of the paper cup, which is still recyclable in single stream recycling, not widely recyclable, but has this similar thermal properties, but also really loves the lid. So we're hoping that will be a win-win. But that it's not just as easy as let's just switch it out because you at the end of the day you're a customer service organization. It's a guest first philosophy, and we can't tell our guests, really sorry that this is why you come to Dunkin'. You're going to have to go to this cup.
So first of all, I completely appreciate you just telling me all that because I knew this was iconic, but I didn't know the details behind it.
Right.
So initially, it was a magnificent design when you think about it.
Right.
An absolutely magnificent design.
Right.
It achieved everything you wanted to achieve. So I thank you. I mean,
I've learned a lot more about cups than I ever thought there was to know. But I mean, this is recyclable. It's not widely recyclable, and you need
Right.
a lot of it in order to reuse it, but you can recycle it. So we'll see what happens with this next round of cups, but
Yeah, it's a
hoping that
Thank you.
it is a great example, an illustration of, hey, this issue, we should just change that. We should do that.
Right.
Everybody wants, of course, it may get very complicated very quickly.
yes.
Every aspect of it, like you said, whether it's a lid piece of it, or recyclability piece of it, or temperature piece of it, and then there's sourcing. So
And the cost piece of it,
Yeah.
and which is no
Right.
small factor when you think about, looking at rising costs across the
Right.
business, and you're voluntarily making a change to a different product.
Well, it's so interesting because as I'm listening to you, change is hard for everybody. And you start out by saying everybody has their morning routine and you have very little time in the morning. You want to be able to predict that routine, get what you want, predict everything about it before you
Right.
go into your probably very unpredictable day.
Right.
But what's interesting to me is as you observe people shifting and changing, you will have great insights how people change their behavior. So towards sustainability, it's actually will be a sustainability story for individuals. So you
Right.
should give them credit for accepting this because it's their first step in being sustainable if they have never thought of themselves
Right.
as doing that.
We're hoping that's the case for anyone in the Northeast. We have the phenomenon of double cupping, which is folks will go in and ask for their iced coffee, and then they'll ask for a foam cup,
Yeah.
which acts as a sleeve, which our franchisees don't like that practice. We don't like that practice, but the guest who does it loves it. And so it's very hard when you talk about change management. Our crew members, or the frontline employees, who are the ones that take the brunt of that feedback from the guest who says, "I want my cup," they're the ones that have to deal with that. And so the path of least resistance, again, first thing in the morning, you've got a long line for speed of service. Often they give that cup, and so if and when we make that change out of foam, the new cup doesn't fit, and so that will be a very interesting case study in change management with that group of folks
Right.
who very much love that practice. So I think we'll be looking at, and we're already talking about how do we wean those folks off of that practice to a point where they can engage in something that's more sustainable, that they feel good about, that still makes them want to come to Dunkin' every day for their
Right.
a great cup of iced coffee.
Fascinating example to watch, actually, because like you said, any CSR initiative has all these competing interests. This one is front and center
Yes.
in terms of the value of the company and where it all happens. And so.
3 years ago, we became the target of a palm oil campaign, and for those that aren't familiar with the issue, it's there are some very serious issues in palm oil sourcing and palm oil production. They often have to do massive clearing in order to plant the palm trees or the palm oil trees. They develop on peat, which when you burn the peat creates these hazy, smoky fires that then drift into other regions. This predominantly happens in Southeast Asia and it's contributed to about 300,000 illnesses or deaths just from these fires alone. And then there's the whole host of biodiversity impacts and displacing predominantly orangutans, but other species, and human rights issues, very egregious human rights issues in terms of human trafficking, forced labor. So there's a lot of issues in that supply chain. We don't source a lot of palm oil. We use it to fry our donuts, and it doesn't take a lot of palm oil to fry. It doesn't take a lot of oil to fry donuts. So while we don't source a lot, the fact that we didn't source a lot and that it was such a huge risk, we said it's not worth making this a bigger issue than it needs to be, given how much we source. We really need to address it. And so we early on developed what I think is we were one of the first folks to draft a palm oil policy with targets. We worked directly with our supply chain team and our palm oil suppliers to say, can you meet these targets? Because you don't want to set a target, we're going to source 100% sustainable palm oil by 2020, and then all of your suppliers have their own targets of sourcing that by 2025. You're not going to source it faster than your suppliers are. So you really have to work hand in hand with your suppliers to say, how quickly can we do it? When can we do it? We also worked with the core group of activists, NGOs in this space to understand what their demands were, to educate ourselves. We also had an NGO that we felt was less activist oriented that we partnered with to educate us on the organization or on the issue so that we could inform the palm oil policy. We benchmarked others that had done some of this to understand the components, issued that in 2014. By 2016, it became really clear that this issue was very complex, that the NGOs were demanding information about our sourcing and the palm oil supply chain that we didn't quite have the internal expertise to be able to respond to. Our supply chain team knows the product in the context of our how we use it, and I knew a little bit, but I manage so many issues that I didn't have the depth of knowledge. So we brought on Rainforest Alliance as a partner to say, okay, here's where our policy is now. We have to report on these targets globally. We don't really know the best way to do that, and even if we did get the information, we didn't know what to do with it. We didn't know how to ask for the data, we didn't know how to analyze the data, we didn't know how to interpret the data, and then we just didn't know how to act on it. So in partnership with Rainforest Alliance, we created a survey, multiple surveys, one for our U.S. supply chain, one for our international franchisees, and one for our their suppliers. And we partnered with our international franchisees to survey their suppliers. We had an extraordinary response rate to those surveys, which in large part was due to the fact that we had a great advocate on the international supply chain team who just made it his mission to get as many responses as we could. But I also like to think that it's because we did a great job of educating them on why this was a risk to their supply chain and that they felt engaged and invested in getting that data back. That might be optimistic, but I like to think so. So once we had that data, we did the analysis. We were then able to understand, so there are two suppliers in our U.S. supply chain that represent the bulk of our sourcing. Those are the ones we really need to focus on. And in our international markets, we had 6 markets that represent about, I think, 76% of our palm oil supply, and that we would then focus predominantly on those 6 markets. So it allowed us to understand, how much of it, we also understood how much of where the palm oil was coming from, for one thing, how much of it was traceable, and who we needed to really focus our limited resources on in terms of ensuring compliance with that policy. So now we are at the point where we are developing a roadmap to implement that policy, bring those suppliers on board internationally to say, do you have a policy? Can you develop a policy, working with our international franchisees to say, can you adopt our policy? And that's all activity that is happening because we had a partnership with Rainforest Alliance that really understood the issue much more deeply than we did. So it's important to know, I think, when you're working particularly on very potentially volatile issues, who are your partners, who are the ones you need to be accountable to, and how do you, the NGOs always want you to do everything fast. Your supply chain team, your franchisees, your internal, whoever your internal stakeholders are, all want you to do it slow. Right. So you are constantly negotiating that relationship and striking that balance between, okay, I'm hearing what you're saying here, I'm hearing what you're saying, how do we meet in the middle? And how do you have those conversations and build those relationships?
And I think that has changed over the years, because I think activist groups were always knocking at the door, banging on the door, and now they actually become your strategic partner.
Yes.
And I have often seen that in a lot of those partnerships, they are the thought leader that helps drive the policy, where before, I don't think companies would have trusted that because of the way that they used to pound at the door as opposed to be invited and walk through the door.
Right.
So.
And on palm oil, for us, one of the reasons that one of the original activities that one of the NGOs engaged in was to picket our headquarters and our restaurant up the street and our shareholder meetings. We haven't, in the 8 years that I've been here, that's the only time that's ever happened. But I think, to your point, they've shifted tactics. I do have a lot of conversations with my peers who say, I'm just going to ignore them. I think you ignore them to your peril.
Right.
I think they don't see a closed door and say, well, no one's home, I guess I'll just try the next door.
Right.
They still will try to bang down that door. So it's much better to invite them in, hear what they have to say, and figure out, okay, if I can't work with this group because they're really on this end of the spectrum, who do I work with on this group? And one of our tactics is to say, I don't know, should I give away the inside baseball to any NGOs on this, is that we'll look at issues trending and say, okay, we think an NGO activist group might come after us on this. Who's our friend in this space? Mm-hmm. So that then you can say, thank you for your call. We're working with this group and to achieve these outcomes. And that group, as long as they have the credibility in the space, oftentimes the others will say, great, we're happy to know that you're working on it, which again goes back to, if you're anticipating what those issues are, you're working on those issues proactively, it allows you to address them on your own terms versus the whoever that activist organization is forcing you to maybe move faster than you want to.
One other thing is that, and this may be more personal, philosophical question for you than that you're speaking for the company, but particularly at Babson and a lot of business schools, and we constantly think about the notion of the changing role of business in today's society. It's different. It's different from when you started, Ken, at Timberland. It's different than years ago when I started the Boston College Center for Corporate Citizenship. And it's different today. And so do you, in your observation, or as you have gone through this trajectory and you also have colleagues who are in the business industry, do you see the role of business in society changing? Do you see the purpose of business changing given transparency and given that everybody can see in and you can see out?
I do, and I would even argue that the role of business has changed in the past 18 months. When you think particularly on issues related to climate change, governments aren't necessarily taking the lead, particularly here in the U.S. And so, as a company, we have started to make the sustainability team has really started to make a stronger case in partnership with our supply chain team that we need to be looking at the impacts of climate change on our agricultural supply chain. And when you think about how are we contributing to it, and both how are we adapting or are we preparing to adapt to the changes in our supply chain. So if we want to source coffee by 2030 and a trajectory that aligns with our growth trajectory, we need to be paying attention now. And those are factors that we need to consider now. We need to prepare, which is difficult in a short-term mindset, but we are making progress in terms of convincing our internal teams that this is something we need to focus on. And companies, I think, cannot afford to sit on the sidelines and wait for someone else to solve that or for governments to step in and regulate that. They really have to evaluate their own supply chains and their own businesses to think about how do we respond. And in a totally different space from a disaster relief standpoint, when you look at the disaster season that we had this year, everyone in the corporate responsibility space had new pressures that they had to deal with in terms of what is our response, because we don't have the resources on the state and federal level to be able to support the needs of folks in our community, whether it's our community as employees or our community as guests, and how can we help augment some of those relief efforts. So I think we see that in different ways, but I think companies, corporations are going to need to be much more mindful of their role in impacting both directly in the community, but also looking at the impacts on their own business and preparing for that now.
Can I ask you something? We had a gentleman in the other day who's a consultant in the world of sustainability and CSR, and he made a statement that surprised me, and he was saying that he's been part of this field for a long time, and that he wasn't quite sure of the value of reports. Can you tell me the value, going back to the reporting process, what is the value? Because I think it's very different for different cultures. What was the value? You said it's about building relationships, you got to know what was going on. What else is the value, and who is your primary customer of your reporting process?
Sure. So I think reports are, for the practitioner, the CSR practitioner, are very valuable because what they do is they allow you to have those conversations with folks. It's an opportunity for you to educate, but also you set goals. So when you talk to people and you look at what are the what goals do we want to achieve? What are you currently doing? What would you like to do? Sometimes it gives folks permission to say, I kind of want to do this. Maybe if we put it in the report and we can sell it in and we can get approval, then that gives me the runway to be able to do this. So it also holds you accountable externally. So for us, I would say, and probably for most companies, it's competitors and NGOs and shareholders if you're publicly traded. So for us, that's our primary external audience.
Okay.
I would say there's others, internally. Our employees probably don't. I would like to think they read that, but I don't think it's required. It's not required reading, and I'm sure many of them aren't lying awake at night reading our CSR report. So it's mostly that external audience, but it allowed me to be, and it continues to allow me to say, this is what we said we were going to do externally.
Great.
Are we going to do that? And I can then say to leadership, we have a mandate. And if we don't do it, we better have a really good reason for why we aren't doing it so that we can explain that in the next report.
Yep.
So I think reports are a very valuable tool for the practitioner in-house.
Great. Thank you.
Sure.
It's interesting, as I'm listening to you throughout this whole interview, it becomes clear, and Ken and I in the course have talked a lot about sort of the skills, competencies, knowledge, and attributes that a person in your role needs. And I'm hearing that, and we've taken a lot of this from the Boston College Center for Corporate Citizenship, but the sort of the optimistic perspective. You're really a community organizer inside and outside. You're an entrepreneur inside. You're a systems thinker. You have peripheral vision. You're a boundary spanner. And so there's a lot of things I'm hearing as you talk about your journey that are skills and competencies that in a lot of executive positions people would not necessarily interview for. But if you look at the role you play as both an inside and an outside person and organizing what you need to organize to get done what you get done, it's a very expansive role.
It is. And I always say, too, that I think the number one competency that you have to have is relationship building.
Yeah.
You particularly if you're in an organization where you have a very limited team and you're brand new, you have to know how to build those relationships of trust very quickly. You can't just go in, barrel into supply chain and say, you need to care about these things because it's the right thing to do, and you're not going to be able to source coffee in 30 years, and therefore you should do this. It just, they would not respond well to that. I think going in and saying, what are you already doing that we can capture? What are your early wins? Are there accomplishments that you anticipate achieving in the next year or two that we can, set those targets and say we're going to achieve this so that we can start to show some early accomplishments? And they'd say, well, but we're already doing that. I'm like, yeah, we're going to capture that. And and shine a light on it and elevate that so that folks know the good work that you're already doing, and then it's, oh, you're making me look good. We do quarterly sustainability updates to leadership, and I often will say to folks, is this something that you need leadership buy-in on? Do you want to come to that meeting and talk to leadership about why we need to do that? And they look at us as, oh, you're giving me a voice with leadership. Like I appreciate that about the CSR team. So there are ways that you can add value to your colleagues that maybe are separate from, ultimately it allows you to add value to the business, but it's a little bit separate from just how is this core to the sustainability
you help
strategy.
that person and his agenda, because it's tough. I mean, the enormous respect for the folks, the franchisees. They are fierce business people, dedicated to their business, dedicated to their people, and dealing with a bunch of issues every single day. And here you are, this corporate person, right? And you've never run a shop like this. And what do you now? You want to tell me to touch
Right.
this? What are you, crazy?
Right.
And so they have to see you very differently.
Yes.
And so, not to put you on the spot, was there, in addition to the sort of CEO access thing, was there anything that you or anyone on your team did to show up differently for them? Because the way you show up typically, I'm going to guess, I mean, my experience is a little bit like this. You have this guy over here doing this, and they're really running the business, and you don't see that. So you got to get them to sort of see you in a very different light,
The franchisees in particular.
in particular.
So there's a couple of things that we've done. We've highlighted franchisees who are leaders. We have a franchisee who has 3 LEED certified restaurants. So we highlighted that franchisee, really made sure that we put a lot of resources against telling his story and why he valued that. We have a franchisee sustainability task force that we bring ideas to and get feedback from. But again, it goes back to, particularly with our franchisees who are small business owners, who make decisions based on bottom line and less on purpose. Not all of them, but a lot of them. Is that I leverage the other people to be the spokespeople. So I've relied very heavily on our chief supply chain officer. I've relied very heavily on our chief communications officer. Operations folks. I prefer to have someone else often tell that story, so that they view sustainability as not that they view the sustainability efforts often not through the sustainability lens.
It's not Christine's thing.
Right. And then it becomes optional and a nice to do. So when we sold in our cage-free commitment, it was our supply chain folks that sold that in. When we did our DD Green Achievement Sustainable Restaurant Program, it was our design and construction team that did that. So it also gives them the opportunity to really learn how to speak the language and become an advocate for that whatever project they're working on. But the franchisees then look at it as, okay, you've thought through this because you come and talk to me about implications on cost increases on, something else, another product that has nothing to do with it, that has no sustainability lens on it. So I know if you're presenting on this, you've likely gone through the same process that you did on that. And I know how you think. I understand what you're saying. You know how I think. So using those folks also builds advocates, but it also helps you with the buy-in. So I have less of a front-facing relationship with our franchisees on the sustainability side, very much so on the foundation side, but less so on the sustainability side, and that is by design.
8+ years in a pretty challenging, steep climb in a difficult and challenging organization. So your perspective on the field. First off, I will note that as you sort of draw your lens back a little bit, you're taking on a new role.
Yes.
And so tell us a little bit about your new opportunity, and then I'll ask you to give a specific reflection, please.
Sure. So I am, as of December 11th, I will be the Global Director of Sustainability for Samsonite. So I will be moving out of the food and restaurant space and into luggage and accessory space. So it's a similar role, but with even fewer resources to start. I'll have no team, no budget. There's no existing program. So again, taking the lessons learned from building the program at Dunkin' and applying them to a different organization, a different industry. So it'll be very exciting.
Congratulations.
Thank
It is
you.
very exciting. You're going to climb that same mountain.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not quite the same one, but
Well, it sounds like you're a builder, and so you know how to. The builder is really the most important part, and then that's the hardest part.
Yeah. I think it's the most fun.
Yeah, it is the most
I
fun.
would agree.
Yeah.
And so from your perspective, one of the things we try to do in the course is to get folks like yourself to give the students a sense of the reality. It all sounds good, and there's a tremendous amount of reason for it to sound good, but it's hard. And so from your perspective, is there something you wish you knew at the beginning of this or about?
I wish I knew how hard it really was. Because you often come into this space because you're idealistic and you believe it's the right thing to do, and you're excited about working with a company to mitigate risk and achieve greater impacts and you're going to change the world, in partnership with all these folks who are definitely going to get on board and want to do that with you in tandem and quickly. And that just isn't the case. The number of times that people internally have said, I don't believe it, I don't support it. Not in those words exactly, but, no, we're not going to give you budget for this, or no, we're not going to invest in additional resources, or no, we're not going to pursue that project. It happens. And it's the reality of, you say, I need budget for this, and they say, well, we need budget for food safety. Well, I'm never going to say my stuff is more important than food safety. We are a food-based global food company. That is more important. And so sometimes you have to take a step back and realize that you are one of many competing demands, and just because you feel idealistically that it's the right thing to do, it may not be the right thing at the right time for the company, and sometimes you just have to be okay with that and figure out how you continue to push forward so that when the timing is right, you can take advantage of it. But it is a lot harder to do the work than I thought it would be. Trying to figure out how you influence folks, how you shift a brand that's been around since the 60s with guests who are passionate about the brand that they've known and grown up with. It's tough. It's really hard. It's rewarding and it's exciting and it's challenging, but it's hard work. It is not. It's not a cakewalk.
Responsibility for everything. Authority for
right. And this fear. I mean, you're an entrepreneur, right? So you go in. People think you have this incredible depth and base of knowledge, and in your own head, kind of figuring it out as I go along. I didn't even know what palm oil was, and so they're looking to you to tell them how to deal with it, and you make a decision and you make a recommendation and think, oh God, I hope that was the right decision. I'm making that decision with the best information that I have right now, and let's hope it doesn't go sideways, and if it does, that I can figure out how to get it back on track. And so I think there's that piece of it as well, particularly for those of us who grew up in the space. I didn't have certainly any formal training on this. I kind of learned it as I went, self-taught, and it's another reason to rely on those external partners and internal partners to help you figure it out. But there is a lot of learning on the job and hoping, God, I hope that was the right decision. I hope we're, and so far it's, I can't think of anything that was a royal disaster or even a semi-disaster. I think we've made great progress and not stepped askance in any significant way.
So realistic expectations, it's going to be hard. Any other advice you'd offer to students, or is that the main thrust?
The other I'd say, and this is probably you can't be too idealistic doing this work, because then your dreams just get crushed all the time. And I've seen folks come in that are super idealistic. You have to temper idealism with pragmatism. Mm-hmm. And you should always have that idealism, because you're the one that's really trying to get the brand to be the best corporate citizen that it can across all facets of the business. But you have to temper that with a certain amount of pragmatism. And I think folks that come into this with just a purely idealistic perspective really struggle with the pragmatism part of it, and it's very easy to get discouraged. So you have to recognize the small wins, find the allies when you can, really celebrate the good work that you are doing while recognizing that some of that other stuff might take a little longer.
And I really, you've mentioned a few times the notion of idealism, and I think that it's, if you come into something because you're idealistic, I think that you will be very disappointed. If you come into something, and I think there's a distinction between idealism and optimism.
Right.
If you come in with a sense of optimism, you can deal with all the things that are going to happen with an optimistic perspective that you can move the needle. But I know so many times I'll talk to students who are so idealistic, and they hear or read about something and they get so discouraged.
Right.
I mean, you could just feel it. And I'm thinking to myself, if you're only idealistic and passionate, you will fail at this.
Yes.
If you are optimistic and future-oriented and entrepreneurial, you will succeed at it, because you will have more failures than you're going to have wins to getting to that end goal.
So
because
true.
because you're dealing with And you said it. This whole space is big R relationships. It's
Yeah.
relationships with every single person that touches your business. And if you don't know how to navigate those and pace who you're going to satisfy first, internally and externally, if you can't pace, if you can't be optimistic that you'll get there, Dave Stengus likes to use this term called destination goals, because they know directionally where they're going, but they
Right.
have no idea how they're going to get there.
Right.
And I think that's a really interesting mindset, because I think most publicly traded companies really need that roadmap because they're measuring everything on a quarterly basis.
Right.
But if you have a destination goal and you know where you're going, and you can't quite get there in the same timing and pacing, it's okay. Don't get discouraged. Be optimistic, because you know that that's really where you bought into trying to go,
Right.
whether by 2020 or 2030.
And I'd take that one step further, is that I sometimes don't always reveal that destination goal. So I would share with the folks on my team when they would get discouraged, I'd say, pretend we're going on a road trip. We know we're going to California, but if you tell everyone we're going to California, they're going to say we're never going to get there. It's too far. The car won't. Will the car make it? They'll come up with every reason why we can't get there. So you just say, hey, we're gonna drive to Chicago. Let's get to Chicago, and then when you get to Chicago, you say, that wasn't so bad. Let's go. And you sort of, but you're going to California.
Right.
And you're just getting them there one step at a time. And in the early days, it's really important not to scare people by saying we're going to California. You have to, but you have to know. And in some cases, you may be able to do that. In a lot of cases, we just simply couldn't do that. It was overwhelming. It was terrifying. It was, and a lot of times you have to recognize that other folks don't know what you know. So we would set goals, and our legal team would say, well, we can't say that. What if we don't achieve it? Or an NGO would make a misstatement in the press about it, and our communications team would say, we have to ask them to correct the record. And we're like, well, one, you can't ask an NGO to correct the record. They're always going to have the moral high ground. It doesn't matter. They're always going to have it. So just let it go and move on, and we'll prove it out over time. And with our legal team, we would say, hey, as long as we're showing progress, it's very rare that companies are sued for making statements that they're not showing progress on. And there was one case of that kept coming up, but.
I think it's BSRs, and the trick is to get them to the table and then move the table.
Yeah, exactly. I love that.
I love that.
Yeah, that's great.
I really like
I think
that.
that's
that
right.
a lot.
Right.
Well, I think we covered a lot of
Yeah,
ground.
we did cover a lot of ground. This is terrific. Thank
It was
you.
great
I've
fun.
really
Thank you.
enjoyed this interview.
Terrific.
And we wish you the
Likewise.
best of luck.
Thank you.